Mark, Paula Byrne is one of our key texts for this week. So can you tell me a little bit about how you came to write it?
I'll tell you roughly what it is first, shall I?
Yeah.
So it's about the relationship between John and Kay. Kay, who suffers from bipolar disorder. That seems very straightforward, except as soon as you get to scene 2, you realise there's something very odd about the play. In scene 1, we have John talking to Kay's brother, finally admitting that he has murdered Kay, Sandy's sister, because he simply can't take any more of the stress in the relationship. She hasn't in fact flown to Norway. She's dead in the cellar, wrapped up in the large bag that the carpet was delivered in a few months ago. It's sort of half funny, half horrible. But then in the scene 2, we get to Norway, and she's in Norway, and you instantly know that something's not right. And that theme continues throughout the whole play. None of the scenes quite fit together. None of the scenes could all be true. So you know that there's some contradiction.
That's what I liked about it. I just kept thinking, is this moment inside Kay's head, or whose perspective is this from? And so that was a deliberately conscious effort on your part to not mislead the audience. But why did you do that?
2 plays were sort of very present in my mind when I sat down to write this. One was Blue Green by Joe Penhall, which was about the vexed question of the disproportionate number of young black men who are diagnosed as schizophrenic. Is it because they're under different social pressures from any other group, or is it because, in a racist way, they tend to be more likely to be diagnosed as schizophrenic? 3 characters in the play. We watched it in the round. We never got really inside anyone's head. It was a talking play, but the subject was interesting, but it was very objective and quite cool. Another play that really influenced me was called The Wonderful World of Dissociation by Anthony Nielsen. It's about a young woman who suffers from bipolar syndrome. The first half of this play is kind of carnivalesque. It's full of all these figures that she has imagined. You know, it's a bipolar high, dramatised as a theatrical extravaganza, with a small man on a tricycle with a polar bear coming out of a hole in the stage. The second half is her in a hospital bed. It's an extraordinary piece of theatre because almost nothing happened. One time you're deliberately bored at great length in the theatre. And that sort of started to get inside the experience of what she might be going through. And I wanted to take it a step further. I wanted several things. I wanted the audience themselves to feel confused and ill at ease, and most importantly, not to know what's real. And you can't know what's real when you get to the end of this. There's even a question of whether Kay, the main character, was murdered or not. If you disbelieve certain scenes and follow a few other scenes right through and take that storyline, then she's alive and she's in Norway. In fact, the actress Celia Imrie, who played Kay's mother in the production at the Donmar Warehouse, she was going home on the bus and she found herself talking to an elderly lady and gentleman who were having an argument about whether the character Kay was still alive or not.
I really like the character of the mother, Margaret. I think one of the things that your play does brilliantly is dramatise or depicts what it's like for the loved ones, the people outside of this. And Margaret saying to John, the main character, you can't know how bad this is. You can at the moment, but just you wait, mate, as it were, and see how it feels. And then it's slowly shown to be true. But he loves her. He feels his love will be enough. And it made me think about, well, also Ted and Sylvia, Marilyn and Arthur Miller. It made me think about what it feels like for the people who love the person who's suffering. And you were brilliant at depicting that.
Character John says something very early on, which I think is really pertinent. When Margaret, Kay's mother, is saying, you really don't understand it. And he's saying, we've been together, we've discussed this. And she's saying, no, you really don't understand until you've lived through it. And he says, I'm quite a boring person. My moods don't swing from side to side. And in normal society, that has no value. But when I'm with someone whose moods are all over the place, I'm the person at the end of the kite string.
The kite string. I love that image when you said, I'm pulling, that was such a brilliant metaphor. I'm pulling this, I'm stable and I'm pulling the kite string. And he feels it and he means it, but he can't know what it's like at that point in the play. And interesting, John seemed to me to be the one using the label, this is disease, it's a disorder, sort of using those sort of medical terms, whereas it seemed to me that the brother and the mother were saying, yeah, it's all very well you coming in quite late to the day, being so sympathetic and wanting to help. We've actually lived with it. And I really liked that he seemed to be so empathetic, but then once he's in it, and then he starts doubting Kay. So there's a moment when I found fascinating, the moment when he thinks she's a good artist and then discovers actually she's not, because the mother then comes in and says, and I was really shocked by that moment, because I really believe, up to that point, I really believed that she was.
I still find it shocking when I read it, actually, to be honest. But we also have to say that scene is slightly contradicted by other scenes.
Well, exactly.
You go through and think, was that real? Can she really paint? Can she not
paint?
draw? I wanted you to, in some small way, occupy her headspace. So maybe she doesn't, when her mood swings backwards and forwards in certain moods, she thinks she's a gifted artist, and then sometimes, as she says, she can't do anything, she's rubbish. There's no way of getting this stuff down on paper. In a novel, something slightly different happens, I think. It's quite hard to be completely ambiguous in a novel, partly because what comes later tends to overwrite what comes before. You know, the end of a novel has a great deal of weight, and something that's happened 200 pages ago, it's already slightly foggy in our memory. There's something about being on stage. If you write a scene well and it's convincing, it's real. And if the next scene's equally real but it contradicts the other one, they kind of grind against each other like cogs. And I really wanted the discomfort of that grinding.
And you like the freedom of the genre, of the form of the play in order to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what you said before makes me think of something else. You said John finally realises something. Maybe some of these scenes are not Kay's fantasies. Once people realise that the play internally contradicts itself, the default position is to say, well, here's a person who has this mental illness, they have bipolar syndrome, they're subject to psychosis sometimes, they believe that things happen that don't, so the play is real life with a few of her fantasies scattered here and there in it. And then if you think about it a bit more, you think, well, maybe they're John's fantasies, maybe the things that he really hopes for. And in fact, you can read the play not as her mental illness and final breakdown, but as his breakdown. He's a university lecturer in philosophy, and he gives a lecture at the end, which starts off as a fairly straightforward philosophy lecture, but he starts to break down in the middle of this lecture in a slightly sort of embarrassing way. And that might be what causes the disciplinary problems we're sort of vaguely aware of in the first scene because they're in the background. And if you then go back in the play, you think, maybe he's the one who fell apart. Maybe he murdered her. Maybe he couldn't cope with this fantasy of being the person who saved her, but he wasn't able to do that. I think the other thing I wanted to say in the play was that when we see someone who's lost a grip on reality because of some form of mental illness, we tend to think that the rest of us know how the world works, and they've kind of drifted off to one side and lost touch with us. I think I wanted to say that we all have stories about the way the world works. You know this if you're in a family, if you have siblings, when you sit down and discuss the parts. No one agrees, do they? Some people think things happened which didn't. Everyone agrees about the interpretation of things. We all have different hopes for the future, and we all have different interpretations of the past. In a way, that's not greatly different to someone for whom mental illness has slightly changed the way they see the world. Why is someone's feeling that the world is utterly bleak and without meaning? Why is that of less value than the rest of us who have something nearer the average? And I wanted to put those two stories next to each other and make people ask questions. Why do we assume that the stories told by people who have some severe mental illness, why do they matter less? Why have we ignored that? When someone is on a real high, and they say, as Kay does say at one section in the middle of the play, how extraordinary the world is. It's like the doors of perception have been opened, and I can see how extraordinary it is. And everyone's dull to this nearly all the time, and I've been vouchsafed a kind of revelation. What gives us the right to say, you're ill though? That revelation doesn't count. It's of less value than the stories we tell each other about the world. Every time I say bipolar syndrome, I feel I need to sort of qualify it somehow. externally, from the sort of point of view of the rest of us, it makes me uneasy because, you know, it's a label. When we hear that someone is bipolar or schizophrenic or is on the spectrum, a little bit of us says, oh, I've read something about that in the Weekend magazine, and kind of dialogue shuts down. I remember years ago, shortly after I finished writing Curious Incident, a good friend of mine, who is a professor of computing, who helped me with a lot of the maths problems in the book, he said, do you know what? I'd love to bring back a society to celebrate eccentricity. He said, it used to be used all the time, and someone would say, my uncle's really eccentric, which of course is an invitation for you to say, tell me, what way? Eccentricity is a very positive thing. It celebrates people's difference and oddity. And it's completely the opposite to a label like bipolar. It opens up debate instead of clamping it down.
How did you research? Did you speak to psychotherapists or people who'd suffered? How did you get inside the head of Kay?
I'm infamous for doing no research whatsoever. I have to be careful saying this, because I can get into trouble. But it's been true since I wrote Curious Incident. If I research something, I never ever use it, which is why I'm increasingly I don't talk to other people, because I feel I'm wasting their time. The fact that I've gone to talk to them about something dooms this thing to end on the cutting room floor. And I think the reason is this. If you know lots about something, it's already real to you. If you don't know much about it, you have to build it from the bottom up for the reader. So you're on the same journey as the reader. Obviously, if you're writing a book set in 18th century Japan or set in Anglo-Saxon England, you have to do the research because you don't instantly know the physical stuff and the language and so forth. But if you're writing a book set now in a cultural background you know quite well, your only job is to convince people. We talk about Christopher in Curious Incident as having Asperger's. Well, I try not to, but other people do. And we talk about Kay suffering from bipolar syndrome. But those categories came later. People say, how did you write someone who fits in that category? And I say, I don't. I write someone, and you put the category on top, and then ask how I did it. This reminded me of another very odd fact about this play. This is going to make me seem extremely stupid. The title, Polar Bears, I did not realise that bipolar syndrome and polar bears had the same word in them. I used to paint quite a lot of abstract paintings, and when I finished a painting, I never knew what to call it, and I always stole the title of some music that I was listening to. And when I was writing this play, there's an album called Nowhere by the band Ride, which was kind of on, as it were, on constant rotation on the turntable behind me, and they have a track called Polar Bear, which I loved. And I thought, I'll use that same painting technique. I'll pluck a track title out of the air.
But you talk about polar bears because of that
I know.
In the play, she talks about going north and the polar bears
and clearly my unconscious is a little more intelligent than the top of my mind, which is quite dim sometimes. It was a really odd experience for someone to say, why did you call it that? And only then did I realise there was a connection, which goes back to my thinking that I didn't think of her as a category. I had to make her a person. I had to be able to sit in her mind and make it feel not comfortable, but make it feel right.
See, I think reading plays like yours are really helpful because I don't have any experience of depression, but I'm interested in it. Obviously, that's one of the reasons I'm doing the course. But I think it's plays like yours that help me see what it might feel like. And because it's so hard if you don't. It's very difficult having empathy if you don't know. And I think that's the purpose of great literature, actually, that it can help us feel like we might get closer. We'll never fully know, but at least it might bring us one step to being closer. Would you?
Well, certainly also with people who have cyclical mood disorders who are very down and very up. I think a lot of what literature does is give us a sort of safe access to the up part. I mean, do you mind if I read a little passage?
I'd love you to read a passage.
Kay is lost at night and John goes to find her. And he finds her sitting on top of a hill, looking at the world. And she's clearly suffering from an extreme bipolar high, and he's very worried about her. So here's Kay sitting on top of the hill. But there are so many worlds, aren't there? One laid over the other. Palimpsest, pentimento. All these bluebells, like this great wave of blue just swept in, wind like a great cold hand stroking the tops of the trees. There are villages underground where people lived before the birth of Jesus, axe heads and bridles and bones. The air hums with signals, TV stations, mobile phone calls. If we had a radio, we could listen to voices talking in 100 languages. Smell, go on, smell. Cut grass and loam and rotten wood, neutrinos pouring through the earth as if the planet were made of smoke. The Great Bear, the Little Bear, Triangulum, Perseus, Columba, the children dreaming in their beds, swords and sandcastles, hammerhead sharks and drunken uncles with dirty minds. In the context of the play, that is Kay being quite ill. She's clearly losing her mind in a real way, not just a metaphorical way, and John is justifiably scared about what she might do. On the other hand, that's a description of what art does, isn't it? Art says there are many worlds, aren't there, one laid over the other. It's all about palimpsest and pentimento, this laid over that, laid over that. And there are so, we can look out here and we can each look and see so many different things. And I think one of the functions of art is to kind of polish your windscreen as well as it can, so you can just see more, see further, see more brightly. And you're right, within that sandbox of art, we can experience secondhand what it feels to be depressed, but we can also feel secondhand what it means to be on that kind of high as well. It's a kind of safe way of sharing that vision of the world.